cotton fields of Whitfield County, Georgia, stretched endlessly under the unforgiving summer sun of 1850. But inside the cramped slave quarters of the Hartwell plantation, something extraordinary was happening that would challenge everything the world understood about human connection. When midwife Ruth pressed her weathered hands against Sarah's swollen belly that humid July night, she felt two heartbeats pulsing in perfect synchronization. A rhythm so unified, it seemed like a single drum echoing through flesh and bone. What she discovered in the hours that followed would haunt her for the rest of her life and create a bond so profound that death itself could not separate it in the way nature intended. Sarah had been laboring for nearly 16 hours when the first child emerged into the candle-lit darkness of the quarters. Ruth caught the tiny body with practiced hands, expecting to cut the cord and welcome the second twin moments later. But as she pulled gently, her blood ran cold. The second child was coming, but they were not separate. Connected at the chest, two perfect faces stared up at her with the same dark eyes, two mouths opening in synchronized cries that pierced the thick Georgia night. The other women in the room gasped and stepped back, making the sign of the cross. Some whispered prayers. Others spoke of curses and devils. Ruth had delivered hundreds of babies in her 53 years, but never anything like this. The twins, two girls, shared a chest cavity, their hearts beating against each other through a bridge of flesh and bone. She could see their tiny ribs rising and falling in perfect unison, as if choreographed by some invisible hand. Their arms and legs moved independently, 4 perfect limbs on each side, but where their bodies should have separated, they remained forever joined. Sarah, exhausted and delirious with pain and fever, reached for her daughters with trembling hands. When she touched them, both babies turned their heads toward her simultaneously, responding to her warmth with an instinct that transcended their unusual form. Master James Hartwell arrived at dawn, summoned by the overseer who had heard the commotion. He stood in the doorway of the slave quarters, his tall frame blocking the morning light, staring at the twins with an expression that shifted from disgust to fascination to cold calculation. Ruth watched his face carefully, knowing that a single word from him could determine whether these children lived or died. Slave babies were property, and property that came out wrong was often disposed of quickly and quietly. But Hartwell was different from some masters, not kind but curious, educated, a man who read medical journals from Europe and fancied himself a student of natural philosophy. He stepped closer, kneeling beside Sarah's pallet to examine the twins more carefully. Both girls were nursing, their small mouths working in alternating rhythm at Sarah's breast. Hartwell reached out and touched one child's hand. Immediately the other child's fingers flexed in response. He touched the second child's foot, and the first one's leg kicked. His eyes widened with genuine wonder. These were not two separate beings awkwardly stuck together. They were something entirely new, a living puzzle that shared sensations across the bridge that connected them. The implications fascinated him in ways that made Ruth's stomach turn. She knew that look. It was the same look he got when he acquired a new piece of machinery or a particularly strong field hand. He was calculating their value. Master Hartwell stood and brushed the dust from his trousers. He told Sarah that the twins would live, that they would be cared for, given lighter duties as they grew. The relief on Sarah's face was immediate and overwhelming. But Ruth heard the unspoken addition to his words. They would live because they were interesting, because they might be profitable, because they represented something unique that could bring attention and perhaps money to the Hartwell name. He named them himself, right there in the quarters, not allowing Sarah the dignity of choosing. The first twin, whose head had emerged first into the world, he called Grace. The second, still connected, still sharing that miraculous heartbeat, he called Mercy. Two virtues that would be forever absent from their lives, except in the cruel irony of their names. As Master Hartwell left, Ruth cleaned the twins and wrapped them carefully in soft cotton cloth, fashioning a special garment that would support their joined bodies. She had no medical knowledge for this situation, no precedent to follow, but her hands knew instinctively how to create comfort. Sarah held her daughters close, tears streaming down her face, whispering promises she knew she might not be able to keep. Outside, the other slaves were already returning to the fields, the overseer's bell clanging in the thick morning air. Life on the plantation continued as it always did, indifferent to miracles and tragedies alike. But in that small room, something had shifted in the fabric of their world. Grace and Mercy had arrived, two souls sharing one heartbeat, and their story was just beginning. The twins grew in ways that defied the expectations of everyone on the Hartwell plantation. By their first birthday, Grace and Mercy could sit up together, their shared torso balancing perfectly as they learned to coordinate their movements. Grace's left arm and Mercy's right arm would reach for the same object at the same moment, as if guided by a single mind inhabiting two bodies. Sarah watched her daughters with a mixture of fierce pride and constant terror, knowing that their uniqueness made them both precious and vulnerable in a world that saw them first as property and only distantly as human beings. Ruth became their constant guardian alongside Sarah, studying the twins with the careful attention of someone who understood that their survival depended on understanding their connection. She discovered that when Grace felt hungry, Mercy's stomach would growl moments later. When Mercy scraped her knee learning to crawl, Grace would cry out in sympathetic pain. Their shared circulatory system meant that illness in one quickly spread to the other, and Ruth learned to treat them as a single patient when fever or infection struck. She brewed special teas from herbs gathered at the edge of the plantation, mixtures of elderberry and ginger root that she forced down both their throats simultaneously. The other slave children were initially frightened of the twins, but curiosity eventually overcame fear. By the time Grace and Mercy reached 3 years old, they had become the center of attention in the quarters, surrounded by other children who marveled at how they could walk together, their 4 legs moving in a complex pattern that allowed them to navigate the uneven ground around the cabins. They developed their own language of coordination, a series of subtle shifts in weight and gentle touches that communicated direction and intent without words. When they wanted to turn left, Grace would lean slightly and Mercy would step wider. When they needed to sit, both would bend at exactly the same angle, lowering themselves with a grace that seemed impossible given their joined state. Master Hartwell observed their progress with continued interest, visiting the quarters more frequently than he had in years. He brought his wife Eleanor to see the twins when they turned 4, leading her into the quarters with an air of pride that made Ruth's blood boil. Eleanor Hartwell was a delicate woman from a Charleston family, uncomfortable with the realities of plantation life, but dutiful in supporting her husband's interests. She stared at Grace and Mercy with wide eyes, pressing a handkerchief to her mouth as if their very existence might contaminate her. But even she could not deny the strange beauty of watching the twins play together, their movements so synchronized that they seemed to be performing a carefully rehearsed dance. It was Eleanor who suggested that the twins be taught to read, an idea that scandalized the overseer but intrigued her husband. Teaching slaves to read was illegal in Georgia, punishable by fines and imprisonment, but the Hartwells saw the twins as exceptional cases, curiosities that deserved special attention. Eleanor began coming to the quarters twice a week, bringing simple books and teaching both girls their letters. She discovered that Grace learned slightly faster than Mercy, but that Mercy retained information longer. Together they made remarkable progress, reading simple passages within 6 months. The other slaves watched this education with mixed feelings, grateful that Sarah's children were receiving advantages usually denied to them, but fearful of what would happen when the girls understood more fully the nature of their bondage. By the time Grace and Mercy turned 7, they had become local legends. Word of the conjoined twins had spread throughout Whitfield County and beyond. Master Hartwell began receiving letters from doctors and showmen asking to examine or exhibit the girls. He refused most requests, but allowed a physician from Atlanta to visit and document their condition. Dr. Samuel Morrison arrived in the fall of 1857, carrying leather bags filled with instruments and notebooks. He spent 3 days measuring every aspect of the twins' bodies, listening to their shared heartbeat with his stethoscope, testing their reflexes and responses. He was amazed to discover that their hearts beat in perfect synchronization, never more than a fraction of a second apart, creating a unified pulse that he described in his notes as the most remarkable physiological phenomenon he had ever witnessed. Dr. Morrison's examination revealed other extraordinary details. The twins shared a liver and portions of their digestive system, but had separate stomachs and lungs. Their spinal columns ran parallel for several inches before diverging, and their rib cages were partially fused, creating a bony bridge that protected their shared organs. Most remarkably, they seemed to share certain sensations but not others. A pinprick on Grace's arm caused only Grace to flinch, but pressure on their shared chest made both girls respond identically. Dr. Morrison spent hours testing these boundaries, mapping the invisible lines where one girl ended and the other began. His fascination was clinical and cold, and Ruth stood nearby throughout every examination, ready to intervene if his probing became too invasive or painful. The doctor left with pages of notes and sketches, promising to publish his findings in medical journals. He told Master Hartwell that the twins were miracles of nature, that their survival past infancy was extraordinary, and that they might live long lives if properly cared for. But he also delivered a sobering warning. If one twin were to die, he said, the other would likely follow within hours or days. Their shared circulatory system meant that toxins from a dying body would poison the living one, and there was no medical intervention that could prevent it. The years between 1857 and 1860 brought profound changes to the Hartwell plantation and to the world beyond its borders. Grace and Mercy grew into thoughtful, observant girls who understood far more about their circumstances than most children their age. Their education continued sporadically under Eleanor Hartwell's guidance, though political tensions made even these clandestine lessons increasingly risky. The twins read newspapers that Eleanor brought, learning about the debates raging across the nation about slavery, states' rights, and the possibility of war. They understood, in ways that made their mother, Sarah, weep, that they were caught between two impossible realities, valuable enough to receive privileges, but never free enough to control their own destinies. Their daily life had settled into predictable rhythms. Sarah worked in the main house now, her status elevated because of her daughter's uniqueness, and the twins spent their days helping with lighter tasks around the plantation. They became skilled at shelling peas, their 4 hands working in coordinated harmony to fill baskets faster than any 2 separate people could manage. They learned to card wool together, to churn butter, to mend clothing with neat, precise stitches. Other slaves marveled at their efficiency, the way they seemed to anticipate each other's movements before they happened. Grace would reach for thread at the exact moment Mercy positioned the needle, creating a seamless collaboration that required no spoken communication. But their uniqueness also isolated them in ways that grew more painful as they matured. The other children, now adolescents themselves, had begun courting and dreaming of families, however constrained those dreams might be under slavery. Grace and Mercy could only watch, understanding that such futures were impossible for them. They would never marry, never have children, never experience the ordinary intimacies that even enslaved people could sometimes claim. They existed in a category entirely their own, too remarkable to ignore, but too different to fully include. On warm evenings, they would sit outside the quarters, listening to the other young people laugh and flirt, feeling the weight of their isolation like a physical presence pressed against their shared chest. Master Hartwell's financial situation deteriorated steadily during this period. Cotton prices fluctuated wildly, and his gambling debts mounted. He began selling off slaves to neighboring plantations, breaking up families with the casual cruelty that characterized the institution. Sarah lived in constant fear that her daughters would be sold, perhaps to a showman who would parade them across the country like circus attractions. Ruth reassured her that Hartwell was too proud to sell the twins, too attached to the prestige they brought him, but Sarah knew that pride meant nothing when creditors came calling. She began teaching Grace and Mercy everything she could about survival, which plants were edible, which could heal or poison, how to read the stars for navigation, how to appear submissive while maintaining inner dignity. The twins turned 13 in the summer of 1860, and their bodies began changing in ways that brought new complications. They experienced their first menstrual cycle simultaneously, their shared biology, ensuring that even this most private aspect of womanhood would be navigated together. Ruth helped them fashion special garments and taught them how to manage the practical challenges, but nothing could address the emotional complexity of maturing in bodies that could never be truly private. Every pain, every change, Every sensation was instantly known to the other. They could not hide discomfort or fear or shame from each other, could not retreat into solitary suffering when life became overwhelming. Their connection was total and inescapable. It was during this time that they met Thomas, a young man who had been purchased by Hartwell to work as a stable hand. Thomas was 17, tall and strong, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see past the twins' unusual appearance to the individuals beneath. He spoke to them as separate people, directing questions to Grace or Mercy specifically, rather than addressing them as a unit. He told them stories about his previous plantation in South Carolina, about his mother who had taught him to read in secret, about his dreams of freedom that he knew might never be realized. Grace found herself drawn to his kindness, his respect, the way he never stared at their joined bodies, with the morbid curiosity that characterized most people's reactions. Mercy noticed her sister's feelings before Grace fully understood them herself. She felt Grace's heartbeat quicken whenever Thomas approached, felt the warmth that spread through their shared chest when he smiled at them, and she felt something else too, a profound sadness that her sister's emotions stirred in her own heart. She cared for Thomas as well, valued his friendship, but she understood with painful clarity that any romantic connection was impossible. How could Grace love someone when Mercy would be there for every conversation, every touch, every intimate moment? How could either of them ever claim private emotions when they shared not just a body, but every physical sensation that body experienced? The reality of their situation had never felt more suffocating than in those months when Grace's feelings for Thomas grew stronger, despite the impossibility of their fulfillment. Thomas himself seemed oblivious to the complicated emotions he had stirred. He continued treating the twins with consistent kindness, including them in conversations with the other young slaves, defending them when others made cruel jokes about their condition. He taught them how to whistle, how to skip stones across the creek that ran behind the quarters, how to identify different birds by their calls. These simple interactions brought Grace more happiness than she had known in years, and Mercy swallowed her own discomfort to allow her sister these moments of joy. It was perhaps the greatest act of love Mercy could offer, pretending not to feel what her body insisted she must feel, giving Grace the illusion of privacy in a life that permitted none. The autumn of 1860 brought news that would shatter whatever fragile stability existed on the Hartwell plantation. Abraham Lincoln had won the presidential election, and the southern states were preparing to secede from the Union. Master Hartwell spent long evenings in his study, drinking whiskey and reading newspapers by lamplight, emerging with increasingly dark moods that he took out on the slaves with arbitrary punishments and reduced rations. The overseer became more brutal, using his whip more freely, creating an atmosphere of fear that permeated every aspect of plantation life. Sarah kept Grace and Mercy close to the main house, hoping that proximity to the family would offer some protection from the violence that seemed to lurk around every corner. Eleanor Hartwell's visits to teach the twins had stopped entirely by December. The political situation made even small acts of kindness toward slaves seem like betrayals of Southern values. Grace and Mercy missed their lessons desperately, missed the brief windows into a larger world that books had provided. They began teaching themselves instead, using the few volumes they had managed to hide in the quarters. They read the same passages over and over, memorizing poetry by Wordsworth and Tennyson, finding solace in words that spoke of nature and beauty, and emotions that transcended their brutal circumstances. Reading became their escape, the one activity that could transport them beyond the physical limitations of their joined bodies and the social limitations of their enslaved status. Thomas continued to seek them out whenever his duties allowed, though these meetings became more dangerous as tensions on the plantation escalated. The overseer watched everyone more carefully now, suspicious of any gathering that might lead to rebellion or escape attempts. Thomas brought the twins gifts when he could, a smooth stone from the creek, a feather from a cardinal, a handful of pecans he had gathered. These small tokens meant everything to Grace, who treasured each object as evidence of his thoughtfulness. Mercy accepted them with gratitude too, but her heart grew heavier with each passing week. She could feel her sister falling deeper into an impossible love, and she knew that nothing but heartbreak could come from it. One cold January evening in 1861, Thomas asked to speak with the twins privately. They met him behind the smokehouse, out of sight from the main house and the overseer's cabin. His face was serious, his usual warmth replaced by something harder and more determined. He told them that he was planning to escape, that he had made contact with conductors on the Underground Railroad who could guide him north to freedom. He wanted to know if Grace and Mercy would come with him. The question hung in the frigid air between them, impossibly heavy with implications and consequences. Grace's heart raced with immediate excitement, her mind filling with visions of freedom, of life beyond the plantation. But Mercy felt cold dread settling into her stomach, because she understood what Grace's excitement had temporarily blinded her to. They could never make such a journey. Mercy spoke first, her voice quiet but firm. She explained what Grace already knew but refused to acknowledge. 2 13-year-old girls joined at the chest, traveling hundreds of miles through hostile territory. Dependent on the kindness of strangers, who might see them as freaks or burdens rather than human beings seeking freedom, the journey would be impossible. They could not run quickly, could not hide easily, could not separate if danger required them to scatter. They would slow Thomas down, make him more visible, increase his chances of capture and punishment, and if they were caught, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for them, but for their mother, for Ruth, for everyone who had helped them. Grace tried to argue, her voice breaking with desperation, but Thomas silenced her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. He told them that Mercy was right, that he had been foolish to ask, that he had let his feelings cloud his judgment. It was the only time Thomas ever acknowledged what existed between him and Grace. This admission that feelings were involved, that their connection was more than simple friendship. Grace began to cry, and Mercy felt every tear as if it were her own, the grief and frustration and rage pouring through their shared body in waves that left them both shaking. Thomas held them carefully, his arms around both girls, and they stood together in the darkness behind the smokehouse while their breath formed clouds in the winter air. He promised he would not leave without saying goodbye, that he would remember them always, that somehow, someday, things would be different. They all knew these were beautiful lies meant to soften the reality that this was already goodbye, that the moment he walked away from them that night, his life and theirs would diverge permanently. Thomas escaped 3 weeks later on a moonless night, taking nothing but the clothes on his back and a small bag of food stolen from the kitchen. The alarm was raised at dawn when his absence was discovered, and Master Hartwell sent riders in every direction to search for him. They never found him, and whether this meant he successfully reached freedom or died in the attempt, no one at the Hartwell plantation ever learned. Grace grieved openly for weeks, her sadness so profound that it affected her appetite and sleep. Mercy grieved too, for Thomas's absence and for her sister's pain, but also for something more complex and harder to name, the loss of hope that their lives could ever contain the kinds of love and connection that other people took for granted. Sarah held her daughters through the worst of their grief, rocking them as she had when they were infants, singing old songs that her own mother had taught her. She did not offer empty reassurances or tell them that everything would be all right. She simply bore witness to their pain, acknowledging its validity while modeling the kind of resilience that had allowed enslaved people to survive for generations. Ruth brought them special teas and sat with them in the evenings, telling stories about other slaves who had loved and lost, who had endured separations and betrayals, and still found ways to create meaning in their lives. The message was clear, even if unspoken. Grace and Mercy were not alone in their suffering, and suffering did not have to destroy them. The spring of 1861 brought war to the nation, though its immediate effects on the Hartwell plantation were more economic than military. Master Hartwell's son Edmund enlisted in the Confederate Army with great fanfare, riding off to Virginia in a new gray uniform while his mother wept on the veranda. The plantation's routines shifted as resources became scarcer and more slaves were hired out to support the war effort. Grace and Mercy, now 14, found themselves with increased responsibilities in the main house as younger. Stronger slaves were sent to dig fortifications around Atlanta. They worked in the kitchen alongside their mother, preparing meals with dwindling supplies, learning to make coffee from chicory root and bread from cornmeal mixed with whatever flour could still be obtained. The war years brought a strange kind of freedom within bondage for the twins. With Master Hartwell frequently away attending to business in Atlanta, and Eleanor Hartwell consumed with managing the plantation in his absence, the strict supervision that had governed their lives relaxed considerably. They began exploring the plantation's boundaries, walking to the creek in the early mornings before their duties began, watching the sun rise over the Georgia pines. These moments of relative solitude allowed them to talk honestly about their fears and hopes, to acknowledge the complexity of their shared existence without the constant awareness of being observed and judged. Grace spoke less about Thomas now, though Mercy knew her sister still thought of him often, still wondered whether he had reached freedom or met some darker fate. Ruth's health had begun declining noticeably by the summer of 1862. The woman who had delivered them, who had protected them throughout their childhood, was aging rapidly under the accumulated weight of decades of hard labor and inadequate nutrition. She developed a persistent cough that no amount of her own herbal remedies could cure, and her hands trembled when she tried to sew or cook. Grace and Mercy took over many of her tasks, insisting she rest more, bringing her portions of their own meals when they noticed she was eating less. Ruth accepted their care with gratitude, but also with a sad recognition that her time was limited. She began telling them stories about their birth in greater detail than she ever had before, wanting them to know the full truth of how they had entered the world and how close they had come to being destroyed in their first hours of life. The twins turned 16 in July of 1863, the same month that news reached the plantation about the Battle of Gettysburg. Master Hartwell returned from Atlanta with reports that the Confederacy was losing ground, that the war was turning against the South. His financial situation had become desperate, and he began selling off land and possessions to pay his debts. Eleanor Hartwell's jewelry disappeared piece by piece. Her silver candlesticks and fine china were packed and shipped to buyers in Charleston and Savannah. The slaves whispered among themselves about what would happen if the plantation failed entirely, whether they would be sold to settle debts, or whether the approaching Union Army might bring the freedom that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Grace and Mercy listened to these whispers with cautious hope, tempered by the knowledge that their unusual condition made their fate particularly uncertain. Ruth died on a cold morning in November, her lungs finally giving out after months of struggle. Sarah and the twins were with her at the end, holding her hands as she took her last rattling breaths. Grace and Mercy wept together, their tears mingling as they pressed their faces against Ruth's cooling body, mourning the woman who had been their protector and teacher and second mother. The funeral was held that evening in the clearing behind the quarters, all the remaining slaves gathering to sing hymns and share memories of a woman who had brought dozens of children into the world and saved countless lives with her knowledge of healing herbs and her steady hands. Grace and Mercy stood at the edge of Ruth's grave, watching as the other slaves shoveled red Georgia clay over the simple pine coffin, feeling as though an essential part of their foundation had been removed. The winter of 1863 into 1864 was the hardest anyone on the plantation could remember. Food was scarce, medicine non-existent, and the cold seemed to penetrate every building, despite efforts to seal cracks and keep fires burning. Grace developed a fever in January that spread quickly to Mercy through their shared circulatory system. Sarah nursed them desperately, using every remedy Ruth had taught her, forcing them to drink bitter teas and wrapping them in every blanket she could find. For 3 days the twins burned with fever, delirious and barely conscious, their shared heartbeat racing so fast that Sarah feared it would simply stop from exhaustion. On the 4th day the fever broke, and they woke weak but clear-headed, having survived yet another challenge to their precarious existence. Master Hartwell sold 10 more slaves in February, including several families who had lived on the plantation for generations. Sarah lived in terror that she or her daughters would be next, but Hartwell seemed unable to decide what to do with the twins. They were unusual enough to potentially command high prices from collectors or showmen, but finding buyers interested in such unique property during wartime proved difficult. He kept them, but his treatment grew more erratic and cruel. He would summon them to the main house to display them to visitors, forcing them to demonstrate how they walked and worked together, describing their shared organs as if they were mechanical curiosities rather than human beings. Grace learned to dissociate during these exhibitions, to let her mind drift elsewhere while strangers poked and prodded and discussed their monetary value. The winter of 1864 into 1865 tested the resilience of everyone who remained at the former Hartwell plantation. Food was desperately scarce, and the bitter cold claimed the lives of two elderly former slaves who had nowhere else to go. Grace and Mercy helped dig the graves in the frozen ground, their shared strength allowing them to work the shovel together with the efficiency that made the brutal task slightly more bearable. They stood at those gravesides and sang hymns in voices that harmonized naturally, their lifelong connection extending even to the pitch and timing of their singing. The other survivors found comfort in their voices, in the visible evidence that two people could be so perfectly united that even death's approach could not make them discord. Sarah's health began failing in February, a decline so gradual that the twins did not initially recognize its seriousness. She had always been strong, the anchor that kept them grounded through every crisis, and it seemed impossible that she could weaken. But she was only 35, and those 35 years had been filled with unrelenting labor, inadequate nutrition, and the constant stress of protecting her unusual daughters in a world hostile to difference. She developed a cough similar to Ruth's, and no amount of rest or herbal tea seemed to help. Grace and Mercy took over all the cooking and cleaning, insisting their mother stay in bed, bringing her water and broth and sitting beside her for hours, reading aloud from the few books they still possessed. News of the war's end reached them in April of 1865, brought by a traveling preacher who stopped at the plantation to deliver the news that General Lee had surrendered and that slavery was officially abolished throughout the nation. The remaining freed people gathered to hear him speak about the challenges and opportunities ahead, about the need for education and community organization, about the long struggle that would be required to transform legal freedom into real opportunity. Grace and Mercy listened carefully, but their attention kept drifting back to their mother lying ill in the cabin, to the reality that the freedom they had dreamed of for so long was arriving at the very moment they might lose the person who had made their survival possible. Sarah died on a warm evening in May, with her daughters holding her hands and her last words urging them to take care of each other, to never let anyone convince them they were less than fully human. Grace and Mercy felt her final breath like a physical blow, the loss of their mother creating a void that seemed to pull all the air from their lungs. They held her body and wept until they had no tears left, until other women from the community came to prepare Sarah for burial. The funeral was held the next day under a sky so blue it seemed cruel in its beauty. The twins stood beside their mother's grave, unable to fully comprehend that they were now truly alone in the world. Two young women joined at the chest with no family and no clear path forward. The weeks following Sarah's death brought a kind of numbness that Grace and Mercy had never experienced before. They went through the motions of daily life mechanically, cooking and cleaning and tending the garden, but without real purpose or engagement. The other freed people tried to help, bringing them food and offering companionship, but nothing could penetrate the fog of grief that surrounded them. They spent long hours sitting by the creek, where they had walked with Ruth and Thomas years earlier, remembering better times and trying to imagine a future that felt increasingly impossible to envision. Their connection, which had always been their greatest strength, now felt like a burden because they could not escape each other's sorrow, could not find individual moments of peace when the shared sadness became too heavy to bear. It was during this period that Grace began having strange pains in their shared chest, sharp stabbing sensations that took her breath away and left her gasping. Mercy felt them too, though she could tell they originated in Grace's side of their joined body. They had learned over the years to distinguish between sensations that belonged primarily to one or the other, to read the subtle differences that indicated where pain or pleasure was centered. These pains worried them both because they were new and intense and seemed to be worsening. Grace tried to hide the severity from Mercy, not wanting to add to her sister's burden, but their shared body made such deception impossible. Mercy felt every spike of agony, every moment when Grace's breathing became labored and shallow. By June, Grace could no longer work without stopping frequently to rest, her hand pressed against their shared chest while she waited for the pain to subside. Mercy begged her to seek help, but there were no doctors available to freed slaves in rural Georgia. And even if there had been, neither girl knew whether medical intervention could help them given their unique anatomy. They had survived 17 years through luck and Ruth's herbal knowledge and their own body's remarkable resilience, but that resilience seemed to be failing now. Grace would wake in the night crying from pain, and Mercy would lie beside her feeling utterly helpless, able to experience her sister's suffering, but unable to do anything to relieve it. The other people at the former plantation noticed Grace's decline and offered what help they could. An older woman named Patience, who had some knowledge of healing, examined the twins and gently told Mercy what Mercy had already begun to suspect. Something was wrong with their shared heart, some deterioration or damage that was causing Grace's pain and would likely only get worse. Dr. Morrison had warned Master Hartwell years ago that their shared cardiovascular system was fragile, that any damage to one twin's heart would affect the other. Now that prophecy was coming true, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. July brought scorching heat and the terrible realization that Grace was dying. The pain in their chest had become constant, no longer coming in waves, but settling into a persistent ache that made every breath difficult. Grace could barely eat, her appetite destroyed by nausea and exhaustion. Mercy watched her sister grow thinner and weaker, felt the struggle of their shared heart, laboring to pump blood through a system that was slowly failing. She tried everything she could think of to help: special teas, cool compresses, gentle massage, but nothing made any real difference. They both knew what was coming, had known since they were children what Dr. Morrison had said about their interlinked mortality. When one died, the other would follow. Patience and the other women prepared a comfortable space for the twins in the cabin that had once belonged to Ruth, filling it with wildflowers and keeping it cool with wet sheets hung over the windows. Grace and Mercy spent their final weeks together, lying on a soft pallet, talking about their lives and their memories, forgiving each other for small resentments accumulated over 17 years of absolute togetherness. Grace apologized for her feelings for Thomas, for wanting something that Mercy could never have chosen separately. Mercy apologized for the times she had resented their connection, for moments when she had wished to be separate, even knowing that separation would mean death for them both. They cried and laughed and held each other as they had in the womb, two souls who had never known what it meant to be alone. Grace spoke about her hopes that somehow, after death, they might exist as separate beings, might experience the individuality that had been denied them in life. Mercy listened quietly, not sharing her own belief that whatever came after death, they would face it together as they had faced everything else. She had long ago accepted that their connection transcended the physical, that even if their shared body died, whatever essence made them who they were would remain intertwined. She found strange comfort in this thought, in the certainty that she would not have to grieve Grace's loss for very long before joining her in whatever came next. The end came on an August morning, when the cicadas were singing so loudly they seemed to shake the air itself. Grace woke with her hand pressed to their chest, her breathing rapid and shallow, her eyes wide with fear and pain. Mercy held her sister, as their shared heart began beating erratically, skipping and racing in patterns that felt like chaos in their chest. Grace tried to speak but could not find breath for words, so Mercy spoke for both of them, whispering the poetry they had memorized years ago from Eleanor Hartwell's books, lines about immortality and eternity and souls that could not be destroyed. Patience sat nearby with tears streaming down her face, bearing witness to a death unlike any she had attended before. Grace died at mid-morning, her final breath escaping in a small sigh that Mercy felt as a sudden emptiness in their shared lungs. For a few minutes, Mercy continued breathing alone, her heart continuing to beat though half of it had stopped. She felt toxins beginning to spread through their circulatory system, felt her own body starting to shut down as Grace's death poisoned their shared blood. But strangest of all was the silence. For the first time in her life, Mercy could not feel Grace's presence, could not sense her sister's emotions or thoughts or physical sensations. The connection that had defined her entire existence had been severed, and she was truly alone for the first and last time in her life. Patience asked Mercy if there was anything she needed, any message she wanted to deliver. Mercy shook her head, already feeling consciousness beginning to slip away. She was not afraid. Grace had gone ahead and was waiting for her, and Mercy was simply following as she always had. Their mother was there too, and Ruth and perhaps even Thomas, all waiting on the other side of whatever threshold Grace had just crossed. Mercy closed her eyes and let go, her breathing slowing to nothing, her heartbeat growing fainter and fainter until it stopped completely. The women who had gathered to witness the death of the conjoined twins wept quietly, understanding they had seen something profound and terrible and beautiful all at once. The community buried Grace and Mercy together in a single grave under an old oak tree near where their mother and Ruth were laid to rest. They fashioned a simple wooden marker with both names carved side by side, acknowledging in death what had been true in life. These were two individuals who had shared one existence, two hearts that had beaten as one for 17 extraordinary years. The freed people who had known them spoke at the grave about their resilience and their kindness, about how they had transformed what others saw as a curse into a demonstration of how deeply two human beings could be connected. Word of the twins' death spread through the county and beyond, reaching the few doctors and scientists who had documented their case years earlier. Dr. Morrison, now teaching at a medical college in Atlanta, wrote in his journal that their survival to age 17 had defied all predictions, that they had demonstrated remarkable physiological resilience and psychological adaptation to their unique condition. But those clinical observations captured nothing of who Grace and Mercy actually were, two young women who had loved and suffered and dreamed despite being born into bondage and into bodies that the world saw as aberrations. They had lived as fully as their circumstances allowed, and they had died as they had lived, together and inseparable. Years later, elderly freed people who had known the twins would tell their stories to younger generations, keeping their memory alive through oral tradition. They spoke of Grace's romantic heart and Mercy's steady wisdom, of their synchronized movements and harmonized voices, of their devotion to each other that transcended even death. The stories transformed over time, becoming legends about love and connection and the mysterious ways that souls could be bound together. But beneath the embellishments remained a simple truth. Grace and Mercy had existed, had mattered, and had proven that even in the cruelest circumstances, the human capacity for love and resilience could create something beautiful. When one heart stopped beating, the other fell silent too, ending a shared journey that had begun in a slave cabin 17 years earlier, and concluded under a Georgia sky that stretched endlessly toward a freedom they barely got to taste. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.